Ladies and gentlemen, today we uncover the dark secrets of one of the most isolated places on Earth, Pitcairn Island. Pitcairn Island's story began with one of the most infamous mutinies in maritime history, the rebellion aboard the HMS Bounty in 1789. Led by Fletcher Christian, a group of British sailors turned against their captain, William Bligh, in what they claimed was an act of defiance against his cruelty. They seized control of the ship and cast Bligh and his loyalists adrift in a small boat, leaving them to fend for themselves in the vast Pacific Ocean. With the British Navy certain to hunt them down, the mutineers needed a place to hide. After a failed attempt to settle in Tahiti, Christian and his fellow mutineers, along with a group of Polynesian men and women, set sail in search of an uncharted refuge. In January 1790, they stumbled upon Pitcairn Island, a remote volcanic rock located over 3,000 miles from any major civilization. The island, unmarked on most contemporary maps, provided the perfect cover. Determined to erase any trace of their presence, the mutineers burned the HMS Bounty, ensuring no one would ever use the ship to leave or be discovered. This fiery act, meant to secure their future, also condemned them to total isolation. There was no turning back. At first, the new settlers believed they had created a paradise. The island had fresh water, fertile land, and enough resources to sustain a small community. However, without any external governance, Pitcairn quickly became a place of lawlessness and violence. The mutineers, accustomed to military hierarchy, struggled to adapt to a free society where power was up for grabs. Tensions between the British mutineers and the Polynesian men, who were treated as second-class citizens despite being brought as equal settlers, escalated into bloody conflicts. In a few short years, violent power struggles led to murder, betrayal, and revenge killings, wiping out most of the men on the island. By the early 1800s, only one mutineer, John Adams, remained alive, along with a group of Polynesian women and children. Adams, realizing the unsustainable chaos, turned to religion and order. He reinvented himself as a leader, guiding the island's remaining population into a more structured way of life. He taught the children to read using the ship's Bible, introducing a Christian-based moral code that would shape Pitcairn's culture for the next 2 centuries. For decades, Pitcairn remained completely cut off from the outside world. When it was finally rediscovered by the British in 1808, they found a self-sufficient community with a unique mix of British and Polynesian heritage. Surprisingly, despite knowing that British authorities were looking for them, Adams and his followers were not punished. The British, perhaps seeing the island's stability as a rare success, allowed them to continue their existence undisturbed. Yet, the foundations of Pitcairn society were built on secrecy and survival at all costs. Over the years, the island's remoteness and unchecked authority allowed dark customs to develop behind closed doors, secrets that would only be exposed centuries later. Pitcairn Island was not just geographically isolated. It was socially and legally cut off from the rest of the world. With no external authority to govern them, the small group of settlers was left to create their own rules. In theory, this could have been an opportunity for a utopian society, free from the constraints of European laws. But in reality, it became a chaotic and violent experiment in survival, where power was determined by brute strength and manipulation rather than justice or morality. In the early years, the island's population consisted of the HMS Bounty mutineers, a handful of Polynesian men, and several Polynesian women brought along as partners. However, an imbalance of power quickly emerged. The British mutineers saw themselves as the ruling class, while the Polynesian men were treated as lesser beings, more like servants than equals. This dynamic created deep resentment and tension, eventually exploding into violent conflict. Within just a few years of settling on Pitcairn, nearly all of the Polynesian men had been murdered in power struggles. Some of the killings were the result of direct confrontations, while others were carried out through deception and betrayal. The mutineers fought among themselves as well, with jealousy, paranoia, and revenge driving them to kill one another. One by one, the original settlers perished, until only one mutineer, John Adams, remained alive. With the male population nearly wiped out, the women and children were left to fend for themselves under Adams' rule. Seeking to prevent further bloodshed, Adams imposed his own system of order based on Christian teachings. He took control as the island's self-proclaimed leader, guiding the survivors toward a more structured way of life. However, this new order came at a cost. Adams wielded absolute power, and the community had no choice but to follow his authority. Despite Adams' efforts to create a stable society, Pitcairn remained an isolated, self-governing community with no external oversight. Over time, this led to generations of unchecked behavior, where certain customs, especially regarding power dynamics and relationships, became disturbingly normalized. There were no courts, no law enforcement, and no way for anyone to escape the island's reality. What happened on Pitcairn stayed on Pitcairn, hidden from the outside world for centuries. Even after Pitcairn was rediscovered in 1808, the British government took a largely hands-off approach, allowing the islanders to govern themselves. Although occasional visits from passing ships provided some contact with civilization, the settlers were essentially left alone, continuing their way of life without interference. This long-term isolation shaped a society where secrecy, power, and control went unchecked, leading to a dark and disturbing culture that persisted into modern times. Pitcairn Island, once home to a small but thriving settlement, has been facing a slow and inevitable decline for decades. Its population, which once numbered over 200 people in the 1930s, has now shrunk to fewer than 50 residents. This decline is not just a result of natural causes, but also a combination of isolation, lack of economic opportunities, and a tainted reputation that has discouraged new settlers from moving in. For most of its history, Pitcairn survived through subsistence living. Its people farmed, fished, and relied on passing ships for occasional supplies. However, as the modern world became more connected, Pitcairn's extreme remoteness became a major disadvantage rather than a hidden paradise. Unlike other island nations that developed tourism, trade, or fishing industries, Pitcairn remained largely untouched, with no major economy to sustain its people. One of the biggest reasons for the population decline is that younger generations do not see a future on the island. With limited education, no universities, and almost no job opportunities beyond government aid or subsistence farming, many young people choose to leave for New Zealand or the United Kingdom, where they can pursue better careers and lives. The island's harsh living conditions, no airport, unreliable electricity, and limited healthcare make it even less appealing for those considering staying. Another major factor is Pitcairn's gender imbalance. Over time, there have been significantly fewer women than men on the island, creating an issue for long-term population growth. Because of Pitcairn's isolation and dark history, which gained worldwide attention in the early 2000s, very few outsiders are willing to relocate there, and outsiders who do move and often struggle to integrate into the small, tight-knit community. The British government has attempted to help Pitcairn survive by offering financial aid and encouraging immigration. In recent years, they have even provided free land and housing to those willing to settle on the island. However, these efforts have failed, as few people are willing to sacrifice modern conveniences and live in near-total isolation. Adding to its struggles, Pitcairn's aging population means that many of its current residents are elderly. With few young people left to carry on daily life, the island is facing a demographic crisis. Unless significant changes are made, Pitcairn could soon become completely uninhabited, leaving only abandoned homes and the legacy of its troubled past. For over 2 centuries, Pitcairn Island remained one of the most isolated human settlements on Earth. With no airport, no regular contact with the outside world, and a population made up almost entirely of descendants of the HMS Bounty mutineers, Pitcairn operated in near-total secrecy. The island's remoteness meant that its people lived under their own informal rules, governed by a small group of men who held most of the power. But in the early 2000s, this isolation was shattered by a shocking revelation. one that would expose horrific crimes that had been occurring for generations and forever change the world's view of this seemingly peaceful island. A culture of silence and abuse. The scandal began to unfold in 1999 when a British police officer was sent to Pitcairn for an unrelated administrative task. While speaking with local women, he heard disturbing stories, accounts of systematic sexual abuse that had been taking place on the island for decades. At first, it was hard to believe. How could such serious crimes go undetected in a community of fewer than 50 people? But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something even more horrifying. Sexual abuse of underage girls had become a cultural norm on the island. Survivors came forward with harrowing stories. Girls as young as 12 years old had been subjected to repeated assaults, often by men in positions of power. Some of the victims, now adults, didn't even realize they had been abused at the time, because these crimes were so normalized within Pitcairn society. There was no police force, no courts, and no external authority to report these crimes to. Many older women who had been victims themselves defended the practice, believing it was simply how things were done on the island. The men accused were not just ordinary islanders. They were leaders of the community, including the mayor and other high-ranking officials. For generations, they had maintained an iron grip on Pitcairn's governance, making sure that any complaints of abuse were silenced. Victims were threatened or shamed into staying quiet, and those who tried to resist were ostracized by the tightly knit community. The investigation and trial. When British authorities realized the extent of the crimes, they faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you prosecute criminals in a place with no functioning justice system? Given Pitcairn's extreme isolation, holding a trial in the UK or New Zealand would have been logistically difficult, and there was also a risk that the accused would flee or refuse to comply. Instead, the British government made the extraordinary decision to send a team of investigators, prosecutors, and judges to Pitcairn itself. In 2004, a makeshift court was set up on the island, and a trial began that would determine the fate of some of Pitcairn's most powerful men. The islanders were divided. Some supported the victims, but others stood by the accused, believing that British authorities had no right to interfere in their way of life. During the trial, more than half of the adult male population of Pitcairn was charged with serious sexual crimes, including rape, sexual assault, and indecent acts against minors. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from victims painted a horrifying picture of a community where abuse was routine and punishment was non-existent. For years, young girls had suffered in silence, trapped in a society that saw them as nothing more than possessions of the men in power. Despite attempts by some islanders to dismiss the accusations as exaggerated or culturally misunderstood, the British courts handed down guilty verdicts for multiple men, including the mayor. The scandal not only exposed the dark underbelly of Pitcairn society, but also raised serious questions about whether the island's isolation had allowed an archaic and deeply disturbing culture to flourish unchecked. The fallout and global attention. The Pitcairn abuse scandal sent shockwaves around the world. For years, the island had been viewed as a quaint, forgotten settlement, a place of adventure and history where the descendants of the bounty mutineers lived simple, peaceful lives. But now, the world saw it as something far darker, a place where lawlessness and unchecked power had led to unimaginable suffering. The British government faced intense criticism for allowing these crimes to go unnoticed for so long. Had Pitcairn been more closely monitored, perhaps the abuse could have been stopped years, even decades, earlier. However, the case also highlighted the complications of governing an extremely remote community, where outside interference is rare and local traditions often go unquestioned. In the aftermath of the trials, there was widespread debate about whether Pitcairn should even remain inhabited. With most of its male population either convicted or under suspicion, the island's already fragile social structure began to collapse. The British government was now in a difficult position. Should it continue supporting an island with such a dark history, or should it withdraw entirely, letting Pitcairn fade into history as a failed experiment in human isolation? The shocking sexual abuse scandal that rocked Pitcairn Island in the early 2000s did more than just expose the dark secrets of an isolated community. It forced the British government to confront an unprecedented legal and logistical challenge. How do you punish criminals in a place with no functioning justice system, no police force, and no prison? The answer was as unusual as the case itself. The British government had to build a prison on the island specifically for the convicted men. Pitcairn, with its tiny population of fewer than 50 people, had never needed a prison before. Crime was almost unheard of, at least, crime that was recognized by outside legal standards. The island operated under an informal system of governance, where disputes were settled within the small community, often without written laws or official penalties. This meant that when several men, including leaders of the community and even the mayor, were found guilty of multiple counts of rape and sexual assault, there was no existing infrastructure to imprison them. The British authorities, having taken the rare step of prosecuting the case on Pitcairn itself, faced a dilemma. They couldn't simply send the convicted men to a prison in the UK or New Zealand, who would maintain order on the island in their absence. Pitcairn's population was already dwindling, and removing multiple adult men, many of whom held key positions in the community, could destabilize the island completely. At the same time, allowing them to remain free after such horrific crimes would have been a global embarrassment for the UK government, which was now being closely watched by international human rights organizations. With no other viable option, the British government made an extraordinary decision. They funded and constructed a prison on Pitcairn Island specifically to house the guilty men. This small, custom-built facility, named Big Fence, was unlike any other prison in the world. Built on a remote, rocky outcrop of land, it was designed to hold only a handful of inmates and was constructed with basic but secure living quarters. The irony was not lost on observers. The same men who had once ruled the island with unchecked power would now be forced to live under strict confinement, in a place where they had once been untouchable. However, building the prison was only the beginning of the challenges. The British government had to find people to serve as prison guards, but who would take on this role in a community where nearly everyone was related or closely connected? Eventually, in an almost surreal twist, some of the prison guards were fellow islanders, many of whom were friends or family members of the convicted men. This arrangement blurred the lines between punishment and community life, making the enforcement of justice far more complicated than in a normal legal system. Another problem arose with maintaining the prison itself. Pitcairn, being a tiny island with limited resources, relied heavily on financial aid from the UK. The cost of running a full-time prison for just a few inmates was seen as an economic burden, sparking debates about whether it was sustainable to keep the prison operational. Critics argued that the UK was spending millions of pounds maintaining a prison on an island where the total population was shrinking every year. Was it worth keeping a prison open for just a handful of men, in a place where almost no one lived? Despite these concerns, the prison remained operational for years, with its inmates serving their sentences under strict conditions. Yet, due to the island's small size and interwoven relationships, life inside and outside the prison was not as separate as it would be in a traditional penal system. The convicted men were sometimes allowed out to work, performing labor that helped sustain the community. This blurred the distinction between punishment and normal life, making it difficult for victims and their families to ever feel a true sense of justice. Over time, as some of the convicted men completed their sentences and returned to society, the prison's purpose came into question. Would it continue to exist indefinitely, or would it eventually be abandoned? And if new crimes were committed in the future, would the UK government be willing to step in again, or would Pitcairn be left to govern itself, as it had for centuries before the scandal was exposed? Pitcairn Island, once home to the infamous bounty mutineers and their descendants, has always been a place of struggle and survival. Its remoteness, lack of modern infrastructure, and tiny population have made it one of the most difficult places in the world to sustain human life. However, in recent decades, Pitcairn has faced an even greater crisis. a declining population, a failing economy, and a future that seems increasingly uncertain. For most of its history, Pitcairn's population survived through subsistence farming and fishing, growing their own food and depending on passing ships for supplies. However, as the world modernized, Pitcairn remained frozen in time. The island has no airport, no hospital, and no major industry. It relies almost entirely on aid from the British government, which provides financial support to keep basic services running. Without this support, Pitcairn's tiny community would struggle to survive. One of the island's greatest challenges is its shrinking population. At its peak in the 1930s, Pitcairn had more than 200 residents. Today, fewer than 50 people remain. The main reason for this decline is the lack of opportunities for young people. With no universities, few jobs, and limited health care, most young Pitcairn Islanders choose to leave for New Zealand or the UK, seeking better lives. This creates a vicious cycle. As more young people leave, the island's workforce shrinks, making it even harder for the community to sustain itself. The island's aging population presents another major problem. Most of Pitcairn's residents today are over the age of 50, and with so few young people staying behind, there are concerns about who will maintain the island in the future. Without new settlers, Pitcairn faces the real possibility of becoming completely uninhabited within a few decades. To counter this, the British government has tried to attract new residents by offering free land and housing to those willing to move to Pitcairn. However, these efforts have largely failed. The idea of living on an isolated island, cut off from the rest of the world, with limited services and no economy, is not appealing to most people. Additionally, Pitcairn's dark history, particularly the 2004 sexual abuse scandal, has discouraged outsiders from wanting to settle there. Another major issue is Pitcairn's economic survival. In the past, the island earned some revenue from selling stamps and honey, but these sources of income have not been enough to sustain the community. In recent years, there have been attempts to promote tourism, with cruise ships occasionally stopping at Pitcairn. However, because the island has no airport and no proper hotels, tourism remains extremely limited. Passengers from cruise ships can visit for only a few hours before they have to leave, making it impossible for Pitcairn to develop a sustainable tourism industry. Additionally, Pitcairn depends on a supply ship that arrives only once every 3 months to bring essentials like food, fuel, and medicine. If this supply chain were ever disrupted, the islanders would face serious shortages. The COVID-19 pandemic further highlighted Pitcairn's vulnerability, as global disruptions made it even harder for the island to get supplies and medical aid. Despite these challenges, Pitcairn's residents remain determined to survive. Some believe that if the island can find a new economic model or attract more settlers, it might have a chance at revival. Others argue that Pitcairn is simply too small and too isolated to sustain a population in the modern world. If the population continues to decline, the island may eventually become a ghost settlement, abandoned like so many other once thriving places throughout history. Pitcairn Island stands at a crossroads, its future hanging by a thread. Once a hidden refuge for the bounty mutineers and their descendants, this tiny Pacific outpost has become a symbol of both human resilience and isolation. However, as the 21st century progresses, Pitcairn faces a slow but seemingly inevitable decline toward abandonment. With a shrinking population, a failing economy, and growing dependence on British aid, the question remains, how much longer can Pitcairn survive? One of the greatest threats to Pitcairn's future is its population crisis. The island, which once had more than 200 residents, now has fewer than 50, and most of them are elderly. Young people have been leaving for years, seeking education, healthcare, and employment in New Zealand or the UK. Those who remain are either too old to leave or have chosen to stay out of loyalty to their homeland. But as the older generation passes away, who will be left to sustain the island? The idea of Pitcairn one day becoming completely uninhabited is no longer just speculation. It is a very real possibility. To combat this, the British government has attempted to attract new settlers, offering incentives such as free land and financial support. However, these efforts have largely failed. The main issue is Pitcairn's extreme isolation. There is no airport, no rail hospital, and only one supply ship that arrives every 3 months. Anyone who moves to Pitcairn must accept a life without many modern conveniences, relying on radio communication and satellite internet for contact with the outside world. Additionally, the island's history of sexual abuse scandals has further deterred potential newcomers. Many people simply do not feel comfortable relocating to a place with such a dark past. The economic future of Pitcairn is also highly uncertain. Historically, the island's economy was based on subsistence farming, fishing, and stamp sales. In recent years, some residents have tried to develop ecotourism, encouraging small cruise ships to stop at the island. While this brings a small amount of income, it is not enough to sustain a growing population. Tourists can only visit for a few hours, and there are no hotels or proper accommodations to encourage longer stays. Without an airport or regular transportation, tourism will likely remain a minor source of revenue rather than a long-term solution. Another major issue is Pitcairn's dependence on Britain. The island's government is almost entirely funded by the UK, which provides annual financial aid to cover basic services like electricity, healthcare, and education. However, this raises an important question. How long will the British government continue to fund an island that is barely inhabited? As Pitcairn's population shrinks and its economy remains weak, British taxpayers may begin to question the necessity of keeping Pitcairn alive. Some experts believe that if the population drops below a certain threshold, the UK may withdraw its support, effectively forcing the last remaining residents to leave. Additionally, climate change presents a new challenge for Pitcairn. Rising sea levels, unpredictable weather patterns, and increased oceanic storms could make life even more difficult. If environmental conditions worsen, Pitcairn's already limited freshwater supply and agricultural resources may become unsustainable. In a worst-case scenario, climate change could make Pitcairn completely unlivable, accelerating the process of depopulation even further. Despite these challenges, some islanders remain hopeful. They believe that with the right investment and planning, Pitcairn could become a self-sustaining eco-community, attracting people who wish to live off the grid and reconnect with nature. Others argue that Pitcairn's best chance at survival is developing stronger ties with New Zealand, possibly allowing New Zealand to take over governance and provide better infrastructure. However, these ideas remain speculative, and without a clear long-term plan, Pitcairn's future remains highly uncertain. Pitcairn Island's future remains uncertain, caught between preservation and abandonment. With a dwindling population, a fragile economy, and growing dependence on British aid, the island is facing a slow but inevitable decline. While some hope for revival through tourism or new settlers, the harsh reality is that Pitcairn may soon become another forgotten relic of history, a place where life once thrived, but ultimately could not withstand the challenges of modern times. Will the last remaining islanders fight to keep their home alive, or will they too be forced to leave, surrendering Pitcairn to the vast emptiness of the Pacific? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain. If nothing changes, the world's most isolated island may soon become its most abandoned.